Hi, I'm Dan Robinson with the Great Lakes Spirituality Project, and I am very happy today to be talking with Reverend John Helt. Welcome, John. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure, Dan.
Yeah. Reverend Helt is a retired minister in the United Church of Christ tradition. He served for 10 years on the board of Wisconsin Interfaith Power and Light, a group whose mission is to inform, train, and activate people of all faiths and faith communities to take concrete steps to respond to climate change. He also served as Wisconsin Interfaith Power and Light's president for about half his time on the board. He's originally from Milwaukee and he lives there now, just a few blocks from Lake Michigan. And as we were talking beforehand, I was just like, oh, that would sound so nice being that close to Lake Michigan. You get a chance maybe to take in some sunrises, I suspect.
It's a great place for that.
Yeah. Well, I'll start with something I read online that you wrote a few years ago for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. It was an opinion piece that was titled "Doing Our Part on Climate Change." And in it, you wrote, "As a person of faith, I'm very concerned about the effect of climate change on God's creation and on our most vulnerable brothers and sisters. I believe that as people of faith called to be stewards of creation, we are obliged to act to protect our children's future." So, could you say a little bit more about the connection between your faith and the concern for climate change?
Yeah, I grew up on a farm in Iowa, and it wasn't till toward the end of my almost 40-year ministry that I sort of discovered the connection between my roots and appreciation for the land and nature and my faith. I attended an event sponsored by Wisconsin Interfaith Power and Light. Huda Alcuff, who I know you have also interviewed, was board president at the time. And Peter Bakken was somebody I knew from the Wisconsin Council of Churches. And the Wisconsin Council of Churches and Interfaith Power and Light sponsored an event where they were encouraging churches to look at how to create green teams to work within a congregation to help people make those connections between their faith and um, and their concern for God's creation. So that kind of got me hooked, and I was very soon thereafter joined the board and helped our congregation install a solar array. Um, and then I retired and have been devoting a little more time to that work, helping people recognize the not only the trouble that the planet's in, but also the compelling ethical interests driven by our faith that encourages us to do something about it.
So, if you were to talk to somebody, like say I came to you as someone in the Christian tradition, and I said, okay, well, make the case for me that within that Christian tradition, why I should care about climate change. I'm thinking about heaven. I'm thinking about the next life. Why do I need to be worried about what's going on here right now?
Well, I think the um, first thing that happens in the scriptures of Old and New Testaments, Hebrew and Christian scriptures in the book of Genesis is creation, and and we're created in the image of God, and we're created alongside of other creatures for whom we are companions and caregivers. There's a lot of confusion over the old translation of having dominion over the world and treating it as if it was our property, and it isn't. And we're all, whether we're human or other kind of life, we're created by God to take care of one another. So I've had this conversation actually with my sister, whose Christian tradition doesn't quite support the understanding of creation that I believe in. And I haven't been entirely successful in convincing her that creation care ought to be a little higher on her list of priorities. But I was reading in your blog this afternoon, you quoted Walter Brueggemann, who was my Old Testament teacher in seminary,
Oh, wow.
and been an influence throughout my life. And And so he gave me my first bigger picture of what the Old Testament Hebrew scriptures are about. And what they're not about is our exploiting one another and exploiting the earth. Um, I've always been a tree hugger, and I about a year ago, I think probably about the time the pandemic started, I read the Overstory, and um, and I've been interested in Peter Wohlleb's work about the hidden life of trees and the secret life of animals and all of that. And I really believe that the connections between human life and other forms of life are much more direct than what we've ever imagined before,
Mm.
and that we need to take care of one another. Um, my wife and I have been mostly vegetarian for um, 45 years, I guess, and growing up on a farm, that was kind of confusing to family members. But I read Francis Moore Lapé's Diet for a Small Planet way back when. I think it's the 50th anniversary year for that publication now.
Oh, okay.
Um, and that kind of pushed us over the edge at that time. So um, it's been a pilgrimage since then of understanding the connections between our faith and care for the earth.
Well, one of the things, it was interesting when I was reading that piece that you wrote. One of the connections you made a reference to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and you wrote that the power of a moral calling connecting to work to address social injustice, referencing that in the piece. So I'm curious what you think the connection is between climate change or climate care and the work specifically towards fighting injustice, or as I think the phrase we would use now is fighting for environmental justice. What's that connection you think in terms of faith?
Yeah. Well, the United Church of Christ that I've been a part of my whole life, it was a kind of pioneer in the 70s, um, talking about it, maybe even coining the term of environmental racism and making the connection between uh, what polluted areas in the country typically are in areas where concerns of racial justice are their worst. These days, the military calls the environmental crisis a threat multiplier. So anytime there's a social problem, um, the collapse of our climate's health just makes it worse.
Mm,
So vulnerable populations, whether it's because of racism or hunger or polluted water, whatever it is. The more uh, climate issues enter in, the worse the problems become. So the justice issues are all interconnected, and environmental issues, I think, are in fact a real threat multiplier that make everything worse.
sure. Well, I want to. Well, thanks. Yeah, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk a little bit about sort of your own personal experience of the Great Lakes. Now, you said that you were from the Milwaukee area originally. That's kind of home territory throughout your life, adult life, I should say, and
Mhm.
um, and you live close to there now. So, describe, if you would, your connection to Lake Michigan or the waters thereabouts.
I went to seminary in St. Louis, and my mentor was serving a church in Rhinelander, Wisconsin.
Ah,
And St. Louis can be pretty hot and muggy in the summers. So the 3 years I was in St. Louis, we found ourselves in Rhinelander, Wisconsin, at least for a week
sure.
every summer as an escape. And so, as it would happen, my first church that I served after ordination, leaving St. Louis, was in Milwaukee. Um, and we've loved the state of Wisconsin ever since. And even though we haven't lived in Milwaukee proper all that time, it's always kind of been a center for us. And the most important natural uh, resource of Milwaukee is Lake Michigan, I think, and the three rivers that flow into it. in and around Milwaukee Harbor, and so it's just a great blessing for us to be living so close to it now. We've also enjoyed our time around Lake Superior, um, visiting Ashland um, and Madeline Island, and just between those are the two of the Great Lakes that we have had the most experience with.
Sure, sure. One of the things that I try to communicate in the project is this idea that where you are, wherever it may be, because every place, as a number of the people I've talked to or read for this project have said, every place is holy, every place is sacred. But there are characteristics that are unique to any place that you would be. You said you grew up on a farm in Iowa. That's going to be a different experience of place than being on the shores of Lake Michigan. Do you think, I mean, if someone asks you, say, well, what's different about being by Lake Michigan or spending time up by Lake Superior versus growing up on a farm in Iowa? Do you feel like there's a certain character to that experience, at least from a spiritual perspective?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, where I grew up in Iowa, we were close. I was actually not far from the Mississippi River,
Mm.
and there were Flint Hills near my hometown. In fact, my hometown, I should get this in, my hometown was the boyhood home of uh, of Aldo Leopold.
Ah, well, that's good to know. Yeah.
uh, and I recently purchased my tombstone for this ancestral cemetery out in Iowa that no one will ever visit. But I have a nice quote from Aldo Leopold on my tombstone. So if you're growing up in farmland like I did, the connections are to the earth and the soil uh, and the nearby waters, whether it's in my case the Mississippi or the Skunk Rivers. But here, yet it is the water is just the feature, and whether it's the Kinnickinnick or the Menominee or the Milwaukee Rivers or it's Lake Michigan, and yeah, there is a spirituality about water that's just as significant as the spirituality that I grew up with of earth and soil, and I'm still learning what that's about, and I'm very interested in you know, First Nations, Indigenous people, and the ways they recognized the sacredness of the land and the water, and what that has meant over the years, and what it should mean for us now. I'm right now reading Braiding with Sweetgrass,
Oh, wonderful book.
and just yeah, it's just a tremendous book. I'm savoring it. I read it like a devotional, like 8 or 10 pages a night before I go to sleep, and it's just a delightful thing. And I'm doing some work now with some. We have an Alliance for Justice in the tribes in the north, and I don't know if that is beyond the United Church of Christ, but there's a Ho-Chunk congregation that is associated with the United Church of Christ up in I don't know, River Falls or somewhere in the north. And so I'm getting more and more associated, at least with the more activist folk who are working with native tribes and talking about uh, how spirituality it doesn't just drive our interest for the environment, but it is the environment in which we live, and so I have a lot more to learn about that.
Well, I love that reference to learning, especially when it comes to sort of interactions with folks from different backgrounds and different cultures, and which kind of makes me think about your work with Wisconsin Interfaith Power and Light. So, as I mentioned earlier, you said you were on the board for 10 years and president of the board for about half that time. What was that like working with people from different faith traditions in terms of addressing climate change and concerns about the environment?
Yeah, I have to admit that my initial attraction to Interfaith Power and Light was the interfaith aspect of it. I mean, I knew I wanted to join some kind of an environmental organization that had a religious um, piece to it. but I was especially drawn to Interfaith Power and Light because of the interfaith nature. Um, I had to admit I spent my entire 40 years of ministry without a lot of contact with Muslim friends, it, working on anything. And on our board, Huda Alkuf was our president, and, and she's been the founder of the Green Muslims, and um, through her, I that just became an important connection for me. That interfaith aspect, and and we've had Jewish board members as well, and they're uh, have developed some lasting friendships that have been very important to me that weren't really a part of the majority of my life prior to the last 10 years. So the interfaith aspect of that has been very important. Learned a lot from one another. One of the events Interfaith Power and Light in Wisconsin hosted while I was president was a conference at in Appleton at the only Jewish synagogue there. Uh, the representative on our board has now retired, but was the environmental officer for Kimberly Clark, and you know, PhD in chemistry, and just a great guy. So that's been very important to me to see all the ways that faith we come at the environmental concern from a faith angle.
Sure. I'm curious because it sounds like a lot of your work right now in terms of the environment and concern for the environment and connecting with your faith is something within the UCC tradition right now. And I'm just curious, what do you see as the advantages and or disadvantages of working in an interfaith context versus a strictly like one tradition context?
Well, it was just time after 10 years. It was time for me to step away from the board of IPL, but I remain connected through friendships with others who are still on the board. Uh, Great Catholic sister from in Green Bay, who's kind of the environmental officer for her community, and just she's not a nun on a bus, but she could be. Uh, um, so I've stepped away from that for a little bit, but still have great interest, and I'm sure I'll go back at some point. But the key thing in the United Church of Christ right now is that a year and a half ago, our national United Church of Christ Council for Climate Justice issued a Kairos call for action, which Kairos being the Greek word for the right time. And they used some language from Martin Luther King Jr. about the fierce urgency of now. This is the beginning of the decade that we have to do something significant about climate change. We can't put it off any longer. It has to be done in these 10 years. We have to keep global temperatures from rising much more than they have. And so this Kairos call to action became something that kind of a rallying cry for us in Wisconsin. And our creation care team was only a few years old in the statewide denomination, and we decided we kind of use this Kairos call to alert our congregations to the urgency of this moment. And and I've been around Wisconsin for so long. I know a lot of the pastors. I know a lot of the church leaders. We have about 215 congregations all over the state. So my ability and access to those congregations is much greater than my interfaith connections. So
Sure.
for right now, my emphasis is on making sure this Kairos call to action, which is it's a 10-year project to deal faithfully and responsibly with this decade that we have to try to get it right and save the planet. So my focus is there for now, but the interfaith aspect of Interfaith Power and Light and other organizations that I also support will keep drawing me back, I'm sure.
Sure. Sure. Um, so as you think about that time back and working with interfaith work with Wisconsin Interfaith Power and Light, um, and if you were trying to say to someone, I think you should join this organization because as an interfaith group, we're able to do this, which we might not be able to do otherwise? What would be the this that an interfaith group can do that another group might not be able to do?
Um, I don't think that we took full advantage of the interfaith connections that we had. Um, but what we tried to do during my time, Huda was a very hard act to follow. I must say, she was a great leader. If you know Huda at all, you know she's a powerhouse. And hers were very big shoes that I had never filled. But uh, what we saw as our role is to work collaboratively with other organizations, whether they were faith-based organizations or not. We worked, for example, with Renew Wisconsin in presenting some programs in the southwest part of the state, uh, drawing, in our case, they were all Christian congregations, I think, in the events that we had. Working with other organizations was our thing, and we were bringing the interfaith flavor to that. So that sometimes meant, well, we had access to a synagogue because one of
Sure.
our board members, but we were never a membership organization. And the point of Interfaith Power and Light is not to develop members, but to share covenants with people, both for individuals and for their faith communities, that they can take a series of action steps to be able to live more in a more sustainable way, and also to advocate for a more sustainable public policy.
Well, as I think about the, the opportunity that I've had through the Great Lakes Spirituality Project to talk to people about different traditions and different approaches to this. You know, you mentioned this earlier about learning. It's really been powerful to me to learn perspectives that I had not considered and approaches that I had not considered. So it seems like a group like Interfaith Power and Light, and I know that they've got, I don't know if they're called chapters or groups in other states similar. It seems like that's one of those instances where the sum is greater than the parts because
Right.
you're learning from each other and you're getting exposure to parts of the community that you might not otherwise have exposure to, both in terms of learning but also in terms of sharing.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, it's always been equal balance of uh, the educational piece, the advocacy piece, and the just making connections. That, I mean, we don't all have to do everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we were struggling with, I think, in my 5 years of leadership on the board of Interfaith Power and Light in Wisconsin, was where we fit in relation to other organizations, Citizens Climate Lobby, Sierra Club, and so forth. So the one collaboration that I'm still involved with representing Interfaith Power and Light in Wisconsin is the Clean Power Coalition here in the southeast part of the state, that is focused largely on closing the coal-fired power plants in Oak Creek.
Mm.
And they've been doing some great work, and the Sierra Club takes the lead in this organization. Um, but as I say, I've been continuing to represent Wisconsin Interfaith Power and Light and that coalition. We're among the sponsoring, collaborating organizations, and there are many others. Um, so I think that's an ongoing. Then they meet at a Catholic convent type community in Racine. So there are other faith connections that feed into that organization, but it's very much a local concern about the people who live around the power plants, and as well as those who are concerned about having a coal-fired power plant in southeast Wisconsin that likes to dump toxins into Lake Michigan.
Sure, sure. Well, that's a good place for me to. I want one last question I want to ask you about bringing us back to the lakes themselves is as you think about the stuff that you've been involved in, like this Clean Power Coalition and the work in UCC Church and with Interfaith Power and Light, if you would recommend like one area that we need to focus on in terms of caring for the Great Lakes and the Great Lakes Basin, what do you think? I mean, in the wide range of things that need to be addressed all at the same time, what do you think would be a focus in particular that we need to address?
Well, I don't want to sound like I'm pandering, but I think you've um, hit the target. I mean, if we could develop a spirituality around the Great Lakes, and to recognize it's not just a natural resource. I mean, it is the heart of North America. You know, it's the pulse of not just the states and provinces around the Great Lakes, but I mean, it's a tremendous freshwater resource that just we've just taken undue advantage of. You know, dumping garbage into it and siphoning it off and tunneling under it for pipelines and yeah, it we have to recognize the sacredness of it. I think before we can fully be careful about it. I mean, as with land for farmers, if you don't see how important it is, you won't treat it as anything other than something that's disposable, which is of course self-defeating because whether it's erosion or poisoning with chemicals, you don't do that to something that's sacred.
Sure. Well, that's a great place for us to wrap up our conversation. Reverend Helt, I really appreciate you making the time to talk today. It's been great talking with you, and I wish you well and good luck with the work that you're continuing to do.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate the opportunity.